Dr. Hal Brands is the Henry A. Kissinger Distinguished Professor of Global Affairs at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. He is one of the nation's leading scholars on U.S. foreign policy. He's a prolific writer. He is the author of, or co-author of 11 books, including the ones highlighted here. Danger Zone, The Coming Conflict with China, and co-author with Michael Beckley, who you'll hear tomorrow. And his most recent book, The Eurasian Century, Hot Wars, Cold Wars, and the Making of the Modern World. He received a BA in History and Political Science from Stanford University and a PhD in History from Yale University. Please welcome Dr. Hal Brands.
Well, thank you, Mike. It's a real pleasure to be here and just an honor to have the opportunity to speak with you this morning. If you'll allow me sort of a 30-second personal digression at the beginning of this. I've been coming to Newport for about 15 or 16 years now, and I've just learned a tremendous amount from the grand strategy conferences that the Strategy and Policy department has put on. I've learned more from scholars like John Maurer and Sally Payne than I can really possibly relate here. And so the Naval War College has been a tremendous part of my education as a scholar and as somebody who has thought about and written about strategy. And so it's just a great joy for me to be able to be here and to offer some thoughts this morning on the state of our world and how to understand that in historical terms. And so sort of my party trick as a scholar is I try to find some way that history can shed light on the particular challenges that the U.S. faces and the particular challenges to international security today. And so that's what I'm going to try to do over the next 25 to 30 minutes. I think that in many ways the challenges that the U.S. faces today are unprecedented. They certainly seem novel and in technological terms. It's true that the United States have never really faced a rival as economically dynamic as the People's Republic of China. And so there is a lot that's new in the world that the United States confronts today. There's a lot also that's not new at all. And so what I'm going to try to do is provide a little bit of an understanding about how thinking about the patterns of international affairs over the course of the 20th century can actually give us a mental map for understanding the challenges that the United States faces across a variety of regions today, and can perhaps impart some lessons that are useful in thinking about the response that the U.S. and its allies need to put together to maintain the international system that they've constructed over the past 80 years, which has served America and so many other countries around the world so well. And I'm going to do one better than Admiral Foggo in the sense that I'm going to have 0 slides up here. So I'm just going to talk for sort of 25 minutes, and then I'd be happy to take any questions or comments that the folks in the audience might have. And the basic argument I'll make here is derived from one of the books that Mike mentioned, The Eurasian Century over there. And that is basically an effort to explain the current moment by thinking about prior struggles for primacy and dominance on the Eurasian landmass and the waters around it. And sort of my capsule argument about how to understand the current moment is that we are simply in the 4th round of a larger ongoing struggle for Eurasia, which has really defined the modern age. And by the modern age, I mean the period starting in the early 20th century. And so the first 3 rounds of that struggle were World War I, where you had a coalition of democracies plus Tsarist Russia for part of the war fighting against the Central Powers, which were trying to establish a position of primacy, really reaching from the Channel coast of France all the way into the Caucasus and the Middle East. You had World War II, of course, when you had sort of an even grander transoceanic coalition that was pushing back against the efforts of Italy, Japan, and Germany to establish hegemony over large swaths of Eurasia, and particularly the key regions of Eurasia, spanning from Europe to the Middle East to the Western Pacific. And then the third round, of course, would have been the Cold War, when you had the United States anchoring a coalition of free world countries, mostly around the margins of Eurasia, in Western Europe and East Asia, in the Middle East, trying to contain the outward expansion of a communist bloc that was sort of headquartered in the middle of the Eurasian heartland. All of those conflicts, all of those wars had their own unique contours, their own unique characteristics, but they were all fundamentally challenges to the balance of power within Eurasia, which adds up to a challenge to the balance of power in the world. And so if you think about sort of why Eurasia is so important, it's fairly self-evident, simply if you look at a map. Eurasia is the place where the significant majority of the world's population lives. That was true at the beginning of the 20th century. It's equally true today. It's where the majority of the world's economic productivity and resources are found. That was true at the beginning of the 20th century. It's true today, even though the center of economic gravity within Eurasia and within the world has moved significantly to the east from where it was in the early 20th century. And so as a result of all that, it is also where the majority of the world's military potential, if not the world's military power and being, is located. And so the sort of the nightmare of strategists in the democratic world reaching back to the end of the 19th century, and more so in the 20th century, was that some aggressive autocracy or some group of aggressive autocracies would seize a position of dominance within Eurasia or within the key regions of Eurasia, and then they would use that position of dominance as a platform to project power in malign ways around the world. And the three strategists that I talk in the book here will be familiar to anybody who spent much time in Newport. It's obviously Mahan, Halford Mackinder, the British geographer who in some ways invented the modern geopolitical tradition, and then Nicholas Speakman, a Dutch-American strategist who taught just down the road at Yale in the 1930s and 1940s and really laid out the intellectual outlines of American engagement in the post-World War II world. These guys were part of a larger transatlantic conversation, really spanning the first half of the 20th century, reaching back into the 1890s, about what regions mattered most in the world and what forms of power mattered most in the world. And they had a significant number of disagreements. And so Mahan and Mackinder had an ongoing debate about whether land power or sea power was the dominant form of power in the modern world. Mackinder and Speakman had their differences over which part of Eurasia was most important. For Mackinder, it was initially sort of the Russian heartland, Russia and Central Asia. Speakman argued in the 1940s that that's not actually the most economically productive part of Eurasia. You really want to be focused more on the amphibious rimlands of Western Europe and East Asia because those are the most economically dynamic parts of the supercontinent, and they're also the parts that have the best oceanic access to the wider world. But they all came together in thinking that Eurasia was the strategic center of the world, and in thinking that a malign hegemony within Eurasia would be a nightmare for the rest of the world because any country or coalition that was dominant at the strategic center of the world would be able to coerce and project power against countries even across distant oceans. The reason that they were all focused on this issue in the particular time that they were had a lot to do with the advance of technology. So Mackinder wrote his famous essay, The Geographical Pivot of History. It was based on a lecture that he gave about 6 weeks before the completion of the Trans-Siberian Railroad across Russia. That obviously precipitated the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905, and it previewed a future in which it would be possible to move armies of greater size across Eurasia, across large swaths of land with greater speed than ever before. Mahan obviously was thinking a lot about the advent of modern navies and what they meant for oceanic power projection. Speakman was really transfixed by the intercontinental bomber, the rise of transoceanic air power and what it might mean for the security of the United States in a world where Hitler in particular had come to dominate Europe. And so when you put it all together, they were living in a moment of extraordinary technological change, when power projection was advancing in fundamental ways. And that simply highlighted the strategic significance of Eurasia and the waters around it for them. And so all of them were sort of looking forward to an era in which there would be a recurring pattern to the great global clashes for dominance. And you would have coalitions of countries within Eurasia that would try to command that landmass and push outwards to its margins and eventually beyond. And they would have to be checked by transoceanic coalitions of countries, anchored first by the United Kingdom and then later by the the United States. And those offshore balancers would have to forge alignments or alliances with threatened onshore powers. These were the countries that Mackinder called bridgeheads, countries like France or Korea or India. And all of these countries would share an interest in maintaining a balance of power within Eurasia and its crucial regions, because that was a requirement for their own survival. And that's more or less what happened over the course of the 20th century. The particular coalitions varied a lot from World War I to World War II to the Cold War. The key areas of combat and competition sometimes changed, but there was a remarkable consistency to what those contests were fundamentally about. And in fact, Mackinder, he was born in the 1860s, he lived until 1947, would have had no difficulty in recognizing the patterns of World War I, World War II, or the Cold War, because they were all ripped, in a sense, from the formula for Eurasian dominance that he had tried to elaborate in that lecture that he gave back in 1904. Now, the costs of these conflicts were obviously devastating. The world wars claimed somewhere between 80 and 90 million lives. Nobody really knows for sure. Another 20 million lives were lost in the various hot wars of the Cold War. The Cold War imposed other costs on the United States and other countries as well. It was waged under the specter of nuclear annihilation and required American strategists to think more seriously about issues of nuclear deterrence and global power projection than they ever had, certainly in peacetime before. And what they showed fundamentally, from an American perspective, was that the cost of repairing the Eurasian balance once it was broken could be prohibitive. And so when American policymakers thought about this, the lesson they learned from World War I and World War II was that the last thing you want to have to do is find yourself locked out of a region that has been conquered by Japan or by Germany and have to fight your way back in. That was the basic challenge during World War II in particular. And so the takeaway from Washington's perspective was that you needed to assemble a strategy that would prevent that scenario from ever materializing again. And this was essentially the key to understanding America's statecraft during the Cold War. The core conviction of U.S. Cold War strategy was that the U.S. had a fundamental interest in preserving favorable balances of power in the key regions around the Eurasian periphery, Western Europe, the Middle East, East Asia, as a way of preventing the Soviet Union from establishing the sort of dominance there that Hitler had managed to achieve in Western Europe in 1940. And so the United States undertook an array of interventions and measures that were unprecedented in its own history as a way of doing that. It created alliance blocks in Western Europe and East Asia that were meant to protect the countries of those regions from external aggression, while also tamping down the internal tensions within them, between France and Germany, between Japan and the nations that it had attacked during the Pacific War and World War II, as a way of enabling greater cooperation against the common communist threat. It cultivated democratic values, particularly in Western Europe, but then later expanding outward from that region into other areas, as a way of creating ideological cohesion at the core of what we would have called the free world, or what we would now call the liberal international order today. And then, of course, the United States invested tremendous amounts of effort and resources in cultivating a thriving international economy that was more open than not, that was meant to provide economic cohesion between the countries of the free world and allow them to attain a standard of prosperity that would ultimately help them outcompete, outlast, and outshine their communist rivals. And all of these strategies worked in a way that would have been hard to foresee in the late 1940s. I think even Cold War strategists like George Kennan would have been, and in some cases indeed were, surprised to see how effective that strategy was over time. And the fundamental decision American policymakers made after the Cold War was to try to keep a good thing going. In many ways, what is remarkable about U.S. strategy after the Cold War is how little changed from the Cold War. The United States didn't deconstruct its alliances in Western Europe and East Asia, even though those alliances had originally been designed to meet a Soviet threat that no longer existed. It kept all of those alliances. It actually expanded NATO significantly into the former Warsaw Pact and even into the former Soviet Union as a way of locking in a more favorable balance of power in Europe. The United States maintained powerful air and naval capabilities in the Western Pacific. It obviously remained engaged in the Middle East and the Persian Gulf as well. And the idea here was basically to ensure that the gains that had been reaped through victory in the Cold War were not squandered by American retrenchment after the Cold War, as they had been squandered by American retrenchment after World War I and the rejection of the Treaty of Versailles. And so you can think about all of these deployments and initiatives that I just talked about as sort of the hard power foundation of the liberal international order that we know today. And that order has brought more prosperity, more security, more well-being to more people around the globe, including Americans, than any prior international order in history. And so that's the good news. The bad news is that these patterns of Eurasian competition have returned today. American policymakers, for about 20 years after the Cold War, had a theory of how you would avert a return to the sort of competition we see today. You would maintain powerful deterrent capabilities in theaters that America cared about, while also integrating potential challengers into the existing international order so they would have a stake in not disrupting it. The first part of that equation worked fairly well. The second part didn't work as well as American officials and many in Washington had hoped. And so when we look around the Eurasian periphery today, you can see more and more examples where a cast of revisionist powers and their proxies and allies are challenging key balances of power more fundamentally than any time in several decades. And it all adds up to what I would consider a fourth crisis of the Eurasian balance of power that the US and allies are going to have to address. And so let me just briefly go around the world and talk about sort of the constituent parts of this challenge, how they relate to each other, and then some of the imperatives that creates for the United States. The challenge to the existing international system is obviously sharpest in Ukraine. That's where Russia is waging a war that is meant to extinguish Ukraine as an independent state. But the goals of Putin's war in Ukraine are bigger than that. Putin is also aiming to shatter the international norm that says that you can't simply conquer and annex territory from your neighbor. In some ways, that has been the pillar of the post-1945 international order. And Putin knows, just as Xi Jinping knows, that you have to break that norm if you're going to succeed in creating or recreating a Russian or Chinese sphere of influence in your near abroad. And that war has been accompanied by a sort of hybrid conflict that is encompassing much of Europe and even beyond, as Russian vessels cut cables, as they engage in illegal overflights, as you see Russian-backed sabotage and subversion in countries from the United Kingdom to the Baltic and beyond. If you sort of move counterclockwise around the Eurasian periphery and you come to the Middle East, you see another instance of the sort of challenge that I'm speaking about this morning. October 7th was really a wake-up call in a variety of respects, not least because it indicated how much damage Iran and its proxy network could cause. That proxy network has been around for a long time. It had obviously been in conflict with the United States for many years before late 2023. But the amount of damage that Hamas, an Iranian proxy, was able to do to Israel, and then the degree to which that attack touched off a multi-front war that was going everywhere from Lebanon to Iraq and Syria to the Red Sea and beyond is an indication of just how much disruptive capability that network had developed. The Houthis managed to put together the most fundamental challenge to freedom of navigation in several decades, certainly since the tanker war between Iran and Iraq during the 1980s. That proxy network has been significantly rolled back now as a result mainly of Israeli military action since October 2023. But we are moving into the crucial period in the development of the Iranian nuclear program. And if Iran is able to attain a nuclear capability, it will almost certainly use that to intensify its coercion against its enemies in the Gulf, in Israel, and the United States, and then try to deter any strong U.S. or international response. If you then move to East Asia, there are two particular sources of stress today. I'll start with North Korea, which is a regional threat that has taken on global implications as its nuclear capabilities and its intercontinental delivery capabilities mature. This is a complicated subject, but I'll try to boil it down. We're reaching a crisis point in the U.S.-South Korea alliance because the North Korean nuclear threat is reaching a point at which it's going to outstrip U.S. homeland missile defenses at some point in the second half of this decade. And when that happens, it will create a fundamental crisis of credibility within the alliance because it will become less credible for the U.S. to pledge that it will intervene on South Korea's behalf if it is attacked, if doing so potentially risks a nuclear strike on the American homeland. We've seen U.S. policymakers and both parties try to get ahead of this through the Washington Declaration between the United States and South Korea a couple of years ago and other measures. But it's going to become a more significant challenge, not simply to regional security in Northeast Asia, but to the solidity of the U.S.-South Korean alliance as well. But then, of course, the big challenge to stability in the Western Pacific and globally is certainly China. And I would simply suggest, and I would echo Admiral Foggo here, the Chinese have certainly read their Mahan. They've read their Mackinder as well. And so if you think about the Belt and Road Initiative and what it is meant to achieve, it's basically a push into the Eurasian hinterland that is meant to provide connectivity that links back to Beijing across Central Asia, across the Middle East, even reaching into Europe, and starting to carve out a Eurasian space that China will dominate economically and then perhaps otherwise in the decades to come. But at the same time, the piece of the Chinese challenge that is rightly grabbing the most American attention comes in the Western Pacific. And it's shown by this really dramatic naval buildup that's been happening over about 30 to 35 years. At this point, it is now accompanied by one of the most rapid nuclear buildups we've seen in modern history, which, in my opinion, is meant to make it harder, to make it more daunting for the U.S. to intervene in any crisis or contingency that erupts in the Western Pacific. And it's resulting in an array of assertive behavior that we would have found quite alarming and amazing even a decade earlier. And I would simply point out that the sort of exercises that China is carrying out around Taiwan multiple times a year now, which simulate a blockade or other aggressive measures against that country, would have been considered quite remarkable 5, 10, 15 years ago, and now they are a regular occurrence. And you're hearing from a larger and larger number of American officials that the situation is becoming critical, that time is running out, that we're entering the zone in which Xi Jinping may be more tempted to try to bring about decisive resolution of the Taiwan issue. And so that the military balance has changed fundamentally, and that's starting to influence Chinese behavior in very destabilizing ways. So you have all 4 of these challenges in 3 of the key theaters to Eurasia, and that would be challenging enough. But it's added to by the fact that these countries are working together in more profound ways than U.S. adversaries have worked together in a number of decades. Vladimir Putin would not have been able to sustain his war in Ukraine without the support that he has gotten from his autocratic friends, the economic support that he has gotten from China, both in the form of trade and then contributions to rebuilding the Russian defense industrial base, or the military assistance that he has gotten from Iran and particularly North Korea. And that influence, that assistance is now flowing both ways. There's fairly good public source reporting to indicate that Russia is providing technological help to a variety of North Korean weapons programs. It's probably not a coincidence that the Iranian missile and drone attack against Israel in April 2024 looked a lot like the strike packages that Russia had put together, sometimes using Iranian drones in Ukraine. You're seeing increasing, accelerating, expanding defense technological cooperation between Russia and China, some of which we can observe from public source reporting, some of which we cannot. And you've even seen U.S. officials like the former director of national intelligence warn that the Russians might find ways of aiding China against the United States in a Taiwan crisis. And so this isn't quite sort of a full-blown military alliance between American adversaries, but it has many of the characteristics of an alliance. And it underscores what I think is the most troubling possibility or the most troubling scenario that could emerge in the coming years, which is that you have a set of discrete regional crises that gradually get wound more tightly together as the ties between Russia and China and Iran and North Korea get tighter. And you ultimately find yourself in a situation like you did in the late 1930s, where a variety of regional crises come together in globally devastating ways. So that is the challenge, and I think it's quite severe, and I think it is quite urgent. Let me talk a little bit about sort of the U.S. perspective on this and how to make sense of American policy today. Traditionally, when facing prior Eurasian challenges, America's role has been to play the convener, the organizer of the great coalitions that push back against Eurasian threats. That was a role the United States played, albeit late in World War I in 1917 and 1918. It was obviously the role that the United States played under FDR in World War II. It was the concept that Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, and other sort of founders of the American Cold War tradition had in mind in the 1940s and the 1950s. And you can certainly see elements of that in recent American statecraft. So if you just think back to the last full presidential administration that we had, the Biden administration, all of the Biden administration's major initiatives in the regions that I've talked about were coalition building initiatives. That's true of the effort to rally a very broad coalition of support for Ukraine after it was attacked by Russia in February 2022. That's true of the coalition building efforts that the Biden administration did with the Quad and AUKUS and the US, ROK, Japan trilateral and a variety of other arrangements in the Indo-Pacific. And it's true of the Middle East as well, where the Biden administration's big goal prior to October 7th was to bring about diplomatic normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, which would allow the creation of a broader, more effective coalition to push back against Iranian power. Not all of those initiatives were as successful as the Biden administration would have liked, but they all indicated sort of this basic impulse to try to play the convener of the key coalitions in American statecraft. And that's not a partisan comment, by the way, because a lot of these initiatives that I just mentioned actually dated back to the prior administration, to the Trump administration. If you think about the revival of the Quad in 2017 and 2018, after it had sort of fallen into disuse for about a decade, that was a Trump administration initiative. If you think about the expansion of U.S. enhanced forward presence in the European theater, a lot of that occurred under the Trump administration as well. And of course, it was the Trump administration that pursued the Abraham Accords, notably the normalization between Israel and the UAE, which would have paved the way for a deal between the U.S., Saudi Arabia, and Israel as well. And so there is a bipartisan tradition of coalition building, coalition anchoring in American statecraft. And that notwithstanding, there is a certain amount of uncertainty about whether the U.S. will continue playing this role today. There are critiques of American global engagement that you see from the liberal left as well as the populist right. And if you just look at sort of the course of U.S. policy in recent months, there are a number of reasons for debate or perhaps of signs of ambivalence as well. There are a lot of positive signs. We see the U.S. pushing its allies fairly effectively, it seems, to spend more on defense in Europe and more recently in the Indo-Pacific. You have a DoD that appears increasingly focused on meeting the pacing threat from China in the Indo-Pacific and a variety of other measures. There are also some less positive signs. I'm not going to go into these at great detail, but I'll just mention two of them. When you have the U.S. engaging in threats of territorial expansion against its allies, that's obviously corrosive to the cohesion of the free world. And I worry, as Mahan might have told us, that when you have ongoing intense economic disputes between the U.S. and its partners, that may lead to a certain erosion of the strategic cohesion that is needed in those relationships as well. I don't want to get into sort of a long litigation of what one administration or another is doing. I'll just say that now I think that there is a perception in overseas theaters, in the Western Pacific, in Europe, that the jury is out regarding the future of American foreign policy. That was very much the sense of uncertainty I got when I was in Tokyo about 10 days ago, and where I've gotten in other overseas locations as well. But the issue is critical because I think what the history of the 20th century teaches us is that there is no balance of power within Eurasia, no favorable balance of power anyways, without the United States. Britain and France were on the path to losing World War I until the United States intervened in 1917. There's simply no way the Allies could have fought their way back into an occupied Europe and defeated Nazi Germany without the American contribution in World War II, and the same goes in the Pacific. That there was no one that could anchor the free world in the way that the United States did during the Cold War. And the same thing is true today. Even in theaters like Europe and the Middle East, where U.S. allies theoretically can overmatch their adversaries, they're going to find it very hard to do so without the leadership, without the rallying of collective action, without the unique capabilities that the United States can provide. And in the Indo-Pacific, of course, there's no theoretical balance without the United States. There is no coalition of countries, even if you put together India and Japan and Australia and South Korea and other U.S. allies and partners in the region, that can contain Chinese power without the support and without the contributions of the United States. And so one fundamental lesson of the past 100+ years is that there is no Eurasian balance without the United States. A second lesson, which I think is appropriate to mention here and now, is that it is better to try to do this balancing early than to balance late. In World War I and World War II, the United States was the global balancer of last resort. It would see if other countries could contain the threat, and then when they failed, the United States would step in. The downside, of course, was that by the time that had happened, you had global wars underway, and the cost of pushing back into Eurasia and righting the balance of power could be quite prohibitive in terms of lives and treasure. And today is June 9th, so June 6th would have been the 81st anniversary of the D-Day landings in Normandy, which is sort of the perfect encapsulation of what happens when you what happens when you wait too long to balance, then you have to fight your way back in to a hostile continent. That's what it looks like when things really go bad and the Eurasian balance of power collapses. That's the scenario that America's Cold War strategy tried to avoid, and I think it's the same thing that American strategy should try to avoid today. A third lesson I'll mention here is that you have to view Eurasia as a whole. Yes, it is important to set regional priorities. The United States did that with its Germany First strategy in World War II. It did that by prioritizing Western Europe reconstruction in the late 1940s and at various other times. It will have to prioritize the Indo-Pacific theater today simply because that is where the military threat is most severe, and to my mind, the consequences of failure, of defeat, would be most catastrophic. But as severe as the threat is, I don't think an Asia-only strategy is going to work. The reality is that the U.S. still has important interests in the Middle East and Europe. And so the danger is that if the United States pulls back precipitously from these regions, the situation will unravel, the threat will intensify, and the United States will have to re-engage under less favorable circumstances than before. And so you get a certain yo-yo effect that will simply be deteriorating on a global scale. And so the U.S. is going to have to work hard to secure multiple theaters simultaneously, and it's going to need a lot of effort from its friends in order to do so. And that brings me into the fourth and final lesson that I will mention, which is that balancing Eurasian challenges requires a global village. All of the coalitions that took shape to push back against Eurasian challengers in World War I and World War II and the Cold War were global coalitions. They spanned oceans, they spanned continents, and that's going to be true today as well. The single most important asset the United States has in global affairs is its network of allies in Europe and the Indo-Pacific, and then close security partners in other regions. They add tremendously to the power the United States can exert on the international stage. They give us access and placement in key theaters around the Eurasian periphery. We need more out of those allies in multiple theaters, just as we probably need more out of ourselves to maintain the Eurasian balance in years to come. And we can have a good debate over what the best tactics of getting allies to do more are. But the alliances themselves are indispensable. And if we ever sacrifice them, if we ever lose them, I promise you we'll miss them very much when they are gone. So I will stop there. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you this morning. I'd be happy to take any comments or questions in the remaining few minutes. Thank you very much.
Okay, Hal, thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation.